Hello, everyone. Welcome to week 4. I cannot believe I'm saying that. This has gone so fast. So we are joined today, of course, by Gina, Dave, and Ricky, as always. We are going to be talking about Canadian rye whiskey and Canadian blended whiskeys and the differences and the subcategories, taking a really deep dive into those. So that's what you have for the next hour. But as always, if you have any questions in Spanish or want to engage with us in Spanish in the comments, please do that, and Ricky can get that translated and sent back to you. So thank you, Ricky, for that in the last 4 weeks of your service. Students, thank you for joining us over the last 4 weeks. We'll say more thank yous at the end of this, but you all have been such a great group, so engaged. It's been awesome. Today we have our last tasting, so be sure you have your kits and you're ready to dig into that. We'll be doing that in the latter part of the course today, but make sure you have those handy. And I am going to toss it over to Gina and Dave so we can get started.
All right, let's dive in. Week 4, here we go. Today we're going to talk about blended whiskey and rye whiskey. And I saw Dave Mitten's post saying that this was one of his favorite classes that we do. And I actually agree with him. I love this one because I love comparing the different styles, especially when we get to rye whiskey. So let's dive into blended whiskey. We're going to talk about this as a blender's palette. So like an art, right? We're going to look at it from a science kind of point of view, as well as an art, the art of blending, I should say. So in this talk about blended whiskey, let's imagine we have pigments on our blender's palette, okay? And these pigments are the things that we can manipulate through the production process to create different flavor profiles and different whiskeys to blend at the end of the process. So we can manipulate the grain, that would be a pigment. At Hiram Walker, that would be corn, wheat, rye, barley, malted barley, right? Fermentation, lots of things that you can do there. You can change the time of fermentation. You can change the temperature. You can change your yeast strain, how much nitrogen, when you're adding nitrogen, all kinds of things there. Distillation style. Here's 3 very common styles of distillation in Canadian whiskey, but there are others. Single column distillation, remember, is going to give you that nice full-bodied, full of flavor style of whiskey. A double column distillate is going to be stripped of a lot of grain and yeast character. And then going from that single column distillation into a pot still, and depending what style that is, you can really concentrate up some flavors there and raise the ABV level. Maturation. So we can choose, the ABV into the barrel. We can choose the type of wood that's being used for different wood extracts we're going to get out of that. Time in the barrel, how long is it going to be aging? Are we using a finishing barrel? Is it going into another barrel that had something in it before? The terroir, or the environment that the whiskey is aging in. And then bottling. The ABV at bottling, different flavor components will stand out at different strengths, and whether or not we're filtering it. Okay, so our artist, Mr. Bob Ross, here is going to paint us a wonderful, layered, complex blend. And here's what he has painted us. These illustrations of barrels represent a blend of whiskey that, depending on the barrel size here, is, representing approximately how much of that whiskey is in this blend. So this blend, you can see, is primarily corn. It's double column distilled, so it's a very light style, but it's aged in brand new American barrels. So you are going to get a lot of wood influence on that whiskey in particular. Now, the second one is rye, and it is single column distilled. So it's keeping a lot of that rye character and the yeast flavor components that come into that whiskey during fermentation. And then it's aged in once used bourbon casks. So they've been used before, not as much wood extract as a brand new barrel, but you are going to get that bourbon influence. You're going to get some dried fruit notes. You're going to get some vanilla caramel from those bourbon notes coming into this rye whiskey. There is another rye that is column then pot distilled, so it's very concentrated rye. There's 2 wheat whiskeys in this blend. You can see different distillation styles there, both pretty big in flavor. Brand new American barrels there, so we're getting a lot of wood influence. And then 2 different barley whiskeys. All of these whiskeys are at 100% of their grain builds, as we talked about in week 2. But 2 different styles of barley. Again, both big flavor from distillation, one in brand new oak and one in those bourbon casks. So a lot of layers of flavor going into this. And if you haven't figured it out yet, it is Gooderham and Worts, which we tasted in week 1. And we are going to taste again today. So make sure you have that out if you have a tasting kit. Okay, so our master blender, this is Dr. Don Livermore from the Hiram Walker Distillery. Our students met him last week in their private workshop session that we hold each week with them, which are 2-hour sessions with our experts. Dr. Don is like I said, the master blender at the Hiram Walker Distillery. He is very experienced. He has a PhD in brewing and distilling. He comes to the process as a scientist and has really, honed in on the art of blending. So much so that last week he did take home a very big award from the Icons of Whiskey as the Master Blender of the Year, which is amazing. And a lot of the whiskeys that he made also took home very big awards from the World Whiskies Awards. So let's look at a video of Dr. Don and how he looks at flavor and how he created his flavor wheel.
Hi, I'm Dr. Don Livermore, Master Blender for the Hiram Walker Distillery. I'll often get asked the question, what makes a Master Blender? How do you become a Master Blender? You have to understand where Canadian whiskey has come from and the methodologies previous Master Blenders have put into place to bring it all together and why we do the things we do today. It's not about years of service. It's not about being trained by the best Master Blender in the world, and it's not about going to school. The most important thing for a master blender is listening to the customer and consumer. It's not about making whiskey for me. It's about making whiskey for you. And the tool that we use is the Canadian Whiskey Flavor Wheel, which I developed in 2017 in coordination with the LCBO. For my mindset as a blender, I'm thinking about 3 things. It's either the grain, the fermentation, or the barrel. The second ring of that whiskey flavor wheel are the things that I can manipulate. I can change the fermentation parameters in the environment for the yeast, like pH or nutrients. I can change the grains around, corn, wheat, rye, or barley. If I want to dial up the spiciness, I increase the rye in our blend. We can change the barrel. I can change the way it's burned. It can give different flavor profiles. I can change the type of barrel that we use. The third ring of the flavor wheel are the things that you care about. Those are the flavor descriptors: banana, pineapple, caramel, toffee. The things I think about is the outside ring of that flavor wheel. Those are the molecular compounds that I measure to bring in to the final whiskey you see here. I hope you have a new appreciation for what it's like to be a master blender in the Canadian whiskey category. The flavor wheel is like an artist's palette. You try to marry all those components together and have an understanding what choices you're making today can affect 20 years later. It's about leaving your legacy behind. I want to thank you for supporting our brands all the way from Canada. Cheers, eh?
All right, so that is Dr. Don. And our students will have another session with him tomorrow where he will take us into the lab and looking at all of the lab equipment that he uses to measure flavor compounds, molecular compounds, some of the equipment that he's invented for the industry. We're really going to get into it and blended whiskey tomorrow with him. Okay, so let's look at that flavor wheel that he described in the video. I know our students all have a hard copy. They have it in their tasting booklets and on the back of that welcome letter. If you're at home and you don't have a tasting kit, you're not one of our students maybe, and you're just learning about Canadian whiskey, you can scan that QR code right there and get yourself one downloaded. So this is the Canadian whiskey flavor wheel. Now, if we use all that lab equipment that he's going to tell us about tomorrow and measure the molecular compounds in Güterhem and Worts, this is how that bar graph lays over the flavor wheel. So now you can really see how these flavors are really coming to life. We saw kind of the artistic layering of flavors, right? How much of each whiskey was in this blend. And now we're really seeing the molecular, the structure of this and how these flavor compounds are coming to life and what stands out, right? So here, cask. When we looked at all those little Bob's painting of barrels there, we saw a lot of new wood, and you can see on that vertical line on the right-hand side of your screen, new American oak is most of the barrels going into this. So you're getting a lot of wood influence, especially that corn, very light corn whiskey. Wow, we're getting a lot of wood extract on that coming out. And then you see the grains there, corn and rye, almost equal. And those were our biggest grains, right, being used. Age certainly shows here, and finish, which is always interesting to me when we don't actually have a finishing barrel. However, those bourbon casks, they're kind of reading as a finishing barrel here, the flavor notes that they're bringing to the whiskey, because they did have something previous in them, although it's not a second maturation for any of these whiskeys. It's just their first maturation into those bourbon barrels. They are reading as a finishing barrel. So that's where that's coming from. So you can really see the flavor, these compounds really standing out and understand what you're tasting. Speaking of tasting, Dave Minton, how about we taste Güterhem and Worts while we're looking at this?
Whatever you say, Professor Fawcett. Remember when people didn't think that those polar histograms were going to be a good idea? Come on, who doesn't love these?
I love them.
Everyone's being so quiet in the comment section today. All right, we obviously went over Güterhem and Worts in the first week when we were talking about history, Canadian history. The Güterhem and Worts distillery certainly had a great impact on the city of Toronto and Canada, first taxpayers of Canada. But today we're talking about blending. And as you all know from the last few weeks, you know that Canadian whiskey traditionally is a majority of a soft double column distilled corn and a little bit of rye. Sometimes there's not even a rye, and it might be 1 to 2 distillates in there. Superhuman eyesight, yes, it's very small, so you can download the larger flavor wheel. This is the opposite of traditional Canadian whiskey. This is probably one of the more complex expressions that we have. As you all know, it's a 4-grain wheat, corn, rye, barley. It is 7 distillates, as Gina went through. So nosing this, looking at it right now, it's a beautiful, Dr. Dawn says luxurious gold, and I don't disagree. When I nose it and taste it, I kind of go through the grains. Like, I get that fresh baked bread from the wheat. When I bring it to my nose, I get a little bit of roasted nuts from the barley, dried spices, a little bit of warming vanilla. And then first sip, I kind of almost get, this will sound silly, but almost like an apple crisp, that light, soft corn, lean, You're getting the ethyl acetate coming from that 10-year-old corn. Certainly baking spices, cloves, some oak character, because as Gina pointed out, 90% of this is aged in new American oak, 10% ex-bourbon. And you get that vanilla toffee. It's great. Beautiful on its own. But as we talked about in week 1, I love this in a Toronto cocktail. I love it in a whiskey sour. You can do it in almost anything. It's very versatile.
Yeah, I would agree. Thanks, Dave. Okay, so let's go back to Bob. I mean, we love Dave, but we need a little Bob right now. So Bob's going to paint us one more blend, which is Triple Barrel Rye. Now, we haven't tasted this one yet for our students with their kits. This is not quite as complex, as you can see here, as Gooderham and Worts. It is a majority rye. This is a rye whiskey, but it is a blended rye whiskey. Majority of that 100% rye that is single column distilled and aged in used bourbon casks. So really look for those flavor notes, that spice from the rye, nice big bold flavor from the distillation style, and some dried fruit, caramel, vanilla notes coming through from those bourbon casks. Secondly, there's this very light double column distilled corn, used Canadian barrels, so it is just light, balancing out these big, bold flavors of the rye, and then just a wee little bit of pot distilled wheat. So very concentrated wheat whiskey here. Again, brand new American oak, so we're going to get a lot of that wood extract, a lot of vanilla coconut going in on this one as well. Back to our flavor wheel. Of course, our polar histogram. How does this lay out? How does the flavor come to life? You see those bourbon casks on the right-hand side. Majority of that rye whiskey in bourbon cask. And that is where the big flavor is coming from. You can see that finish, right? It's not really finished. It's not a second maturation, but it is a barrel that has had bourbon in it before. The next biggest thing is rye. That's our big, bold rye whiskey. Floral, fruity notes. Those are coming from the yeast development. That development of flavor from the yeast during fermentation. Cask, again, we got some new American oak, those bourbon casks going in there. So we're getting a lot of nice layers of flavor here, even though it's not as complex as Gooderham and Worts. So Dave, why don't you take us through this? Let's taste it.
Let's do it. Well, and also don't drink this all at once, folks. We're going to be going back to this later on in the class. So we're going to kind of do a two-parter with it. Now, the story with this J.P. Weiser's Triple Barrel Rye, we always say it's a Canadian whiskey made with the American palate in mind. Very marketing sentence there, but it's true. If any of you are old enough or maybe lived somewhere in a state where you've seen a bottle that we used to produce, it's a cream label, J.P. Weiser's, and it says RYE on the label. That was something the company produced over a decade ago. It is gone, but I'll occasionally see it in the shelf somewhere. And basically what they did was it was a high rye Canadian whiskey, but I mean probably like 10%, 15% rye in it. So the marketing, the labeling, it was misleading. America didn't like it. They were almost offended by it. We went back to the drawing board. This is after I started, and the task was given to Dr. Don to create a Canadian whiskey with the American palate in mind. And this is what he came up with. Again, Canadian whiskey, traditional, mostly soft double column distilled corn with a pinch of rye. What you have here is 67% once column distilled rye. 60% once column distilled rye, 37% double column distilled corn, and 3% column and pot distilled wheat. So again, looking at it, beautiful, rich amber color. I mean, I get sourdough rye right away. Kind of hints of banana too. Almost like those candy bananas. You know what I'm talking about? Those hard things you see at Halloween. Certainly get a little bit of sour cherry, some spice notes, baking spices, lots of oak, vanilla. And then, I mean, your first sip. That's a rye. It's a rye through and through. I mean, it's a very round, firm and elegant almost. You know, I get some delicate florals off of it. Certainly the baking spices on the first sip. Almost like a honey ginger. I love this one. Price-wise, and this unfortunately is only available in the US. You can't buy this in Canada. Can't buy it overseas. Only sold in the US. It's about $20 a bottle too, which is great. So we've never expected to go on a rail in the US with the Canadian whiskey, but we have seen this make a lot of rail placements because bars are making their old fashions and Manhattans with it.
Because it's delicious. Mm-hmm.
Sorry, Canada. You can't try this one. But the students can.
Before we head into rye whiskey, speaking of rye, are there any questions that have come through leading up to now?
Let's see here. I believe there was a question earlier about gluten. We're going to leave that for Dr. Dawn tomorrow. Has Hiram Walker ever used different wood on the barrel bottom of an aging whiskey barrel as an experiment?
I don't know the answer to that, Dave. Do you? I think that's a great question for Dawn tomorrow. I don't actually know the answer.
I was going to say I might have something to contribute, but I would prefer Dr. Dawn to answer that tomorrow.
All right.
He's got some pretty cool experiments coming up. He's got some stuff happening now. We'll let the doctor cover that tomorrow.
All right. Shall we head into rye whiskey?
Works for me, Prof.
Let's do it. All right. Rye whiskey. One of my favorite things to talk about. Canadian rye. So let's just kind of go back, review for a moment. What does that mean? Remember from history section, week 1, it was during the 1800s that, you know, anyone in Canada making whiskey was pretty much making it from wheat, eventually corn. But they did start to get their hands on rye and how to distill rye from the Germans. And so then they started putting in a little bit of rye, 5 to 10%. And so you either ordered a whiskey or you ordered a rye. And that is why to today's standards, there's no minimum amount of rye that needs to be in a Canadian rye. It's an ode to their history. It's part of their history of why they do that. The regulations, though, rye is such a big component that it is titled Canadian whiskey, Canadian rye whiskey, or rye whiskey. Rye is stated twice. And there are so many different styles. That traditional style of Canadian whiskey, mostly corn today, a little bit of rye. That's J.P. Weiser's 10, which we tasted in week 1. That's a traditional style of Canadian whiskey. It could also be called a rye in Canada. What we just tasted, triple barrel rye, that is a rye blend, but very rye forward. And then we're also going to taste later on lot number 40, which is 100% rye. So it is one of those distillates that is being produced at the Hiram Walker Distillery. So very different styles throughout Canada. And of course, there are more styles than just this, but this really shows you the breadth and the scope of rye in Canada. It can mean so many different things. So in comparing to American rye, and a lot of these actually are pretty relevant to other whiskey categories within these countries, but let's talk about it as rye, okay? So when we're talking about a mash bill or a grain build, like I like to call it in Canada, typically speaking, remember, not regulated to do this, so not everyone is, doesn't have to. But traditionally speaking, at this point, most of your bigger distilleries, most of the Canadian whiskey being made is from 100% grain builds. In the US, they are making mash bills. Must be at least 51% rye in that mash bill. Blend those grains at the beginning of the production and then put it through the process to make a whiskey, right? Usually they're going to have barley, sometimes other grains in there, but they're going to blend those grains at the beginning of the process. Fermentation. Most of the time in Canada, they're going to be using exogenous enzymes unless there is malt in there, mixed in there. You know, they're really going to use exogenous enzymes. 100% rye needs an exogenous enzyme. It needs to get an enzyme to help that process along from somewhere. Now, in the US, American rye, you know, you're going to see a lot of distilleries that like to talk about, you know, they use malted barley for those enzymes. Most of them are also using exogenous enzymes, not all, but most of them, because it's just not enough. They're not getting enough from that malted barley. So they need some exogenous enzymes to really help that process along and break up that starch in all of those grains. Distillation styles, there's many different distillation styles across Canada. Your most common ones, though, are going to be that double column distillation to make that very light style, that single column distillation, and then the column into a pot. In the US, there are regulations that distillation for rye whiskey cannot exceed 160 proof. Most are going to use a single column distillation and then go into a doubler, which is kind of like a very quick second distillation to get more copper contact, raise the ABV a little bit. And you're usually not going to see cup points being made on this whiskey. And that's the same for the single column distillation in Canada. You're usually not going to see cup points on that. Maturation, all Canadian whiskey, this includes rye whiskey, must be aged for a minimum of 3 years in 700 liter or less barrels or casks, as Dr. Don corrected us all last week, right? And in the US, there are regulations. There is no minimum age requirement on rye whiskey. It does have to be aged in new charred oak, brand new charred oak. But there's no regulation on how long. So you could age it for 5 minutes. I mean, I don't know the point of that. Barrels are expensive. You're not going to get a lot of wood extract. So, you could. If it's a straight rye, however, then you're going to have to age it a minimum of 2 years in the US. So 3 years in Canada for rye whiskey, no minimum for most ryes in the US. Unless it's a straight rye, then you've got a minimum of two years. And then blending. So in Canada, they're going to blend different whiskeys, typically at 100% grain builds. They're going to blend different ages. They're going to blend different barrel types. All kinds of different whiskey flavor profiles going into a blend to produce a very specific flavor profile of the blended whiskey at the end. And they're typically going to do that after maturation. In the US, this is a fun topic, blending, because we don't label our ryes blended whiskey unless it's a blended whiskey with some other whiskeys in there. So you're going to see most distilleries, they like to say mingle rather than blend. They're putting it together. It's the same thing. But it's going to typically be the same mash bill. Most distilleries aren't making too many different rye mash bills. They'll typically make one, maybe two. They're going to blend different ages of that same mash bill. same barrel type because it has to be brand new charred oak, right? To produce a specific flavor profile. So they're not going to have as much room to make different innovations. They can, but they're not going to have as much wiggle room there. And then some are going to blend different mash bills completely different whiskeys. So they can also do that from different distilleries. So completely different whiskeys from completely different distilleries, as long as they are both, let's say, straight ryes, or there's 3 or 4 of them, however many there are, they blend them together. They do not have to label it by regulation in the US. They do not have to label it a blended whiskey. They can label that a straight rye whiskey, as long as all the whiskeys, although they are completely different, that are being blended together are straight rye whiskeys. So interesting how we label things and the regulations that go along with it. We get a lot of misconceptions about that. Okay, so why rye? Let's look at rye very specifically. This is plant fiber. Okay, and you see the cellulose, hemicellulose, lignin. We talked about this with maturation in the wood because wood is a plant fiber, right? Made up of the same stuff. So there's your plant fiber. Rye has more lignin than any of the other grains. If you look at that chart there, you can see there is more lignin in rye than any of the other grains. Okay, what does that mean? Here's lignin. This is the molecular structure of lignin. Giant molecule. When we heat it, cooking, distillation, we're heating it up, we're breaking this molecule apart into smaller molecules. And what are we getting? These flavor compounds. It's like exposing these flavor compounds. Smoky, burnt, leather spice, spicy sweet smoke, bacon notes, creosote, clove. That's a big one, right? With rye whiskey, that's used a lot in tasting notes because a lot of people taste that. And so when you pot distill it, you can increase the lignin compounds because you're concentrating those compounds by making your cut points where you want them to be. So you can really concentrate up that spice. So looking at that flavor wheel again, and if we look at rye from the center, grain, rye, every one of those descriptors starts with the word spicy. Spicy smoky bacon, spicy leathery vanilla, spicy smoky savory, blah, blah, blah. It is spicy. Rye equals spice. It's going to add spice notes to your whiskey. Okay, Dave, let's taste some rye whiskey.
All right. Are we tackling any questions at all right now?
Up to you.
Let's look. Hold on, folks.
Look.
Is rye not a grain? Rye is a grain. Rye is a grain that we use a lot of. I think that might have came up when you were talking about rye being blended into corn flavoring. Rye is a grain. Yep. Cereal grain. There's a question about labeling, but I think you tackled that. Well, let's read it, make sure. Is there not a regulation on marketing, labeling in Canada depending on the mash bill or because of the blending process? Asking how Canada chooses to label the grain on the bottle. I feel you did tackle that.
Yeah, I mean, they don't have to call out the grains on the bottle. No. So, for instance, here in the US, rye whiskey is at least 51% rye. Do we have to put the rest of the mash bill on the label in the US? Nope, don't have to. Again, right. But we don't have to.
Let's go into what I'm going to do. I'm noticing there's a lot of tasting notes from the JPY's Triple Barrel Rye, so we're going to go into that a little bit. There's also, this is the first time I've heard of this, there's people, Canadians, saying they're going to go to the US to buy this to bring it back to Canada. It's probably the only Canadian whiskey ever to be brought into the country of Canada. So let's go back. We went over this. This is a perfect example of a blended rye. 60% once column distilled rye, 37% double column distilled corn, 3% column and pot distilled wheat. Dylan says, has that butter thang. Yeah, definitely that. Nice mouthfeel. Nanette said affordable. It is affordable. $20 a bottle. Lots of vanilla. Apple pie. Totally agree with that.
Carlos is saying there's lots of cinnamon, strong, long-lasting on the palate. Cinnamon, yeah. Call out on cinnamon.
100%. It's almost a cinnamon heart. This is the first time I'm thinking of that. You know, Valentine's Day's coming up. It's like a nice little cinnamon heart.
Mm-hmm.
You're wearing red today. Is that because of Valentine's Day?
I'm wearing my Canada shirt. Mm-hmm.
So yeah, this one, great expression of a blended rye whiskey. I love this one. I think it's one of the nicer whiskeys coming out of the distillery, but we don't see it everywhere in the U.S. So if you see a bottle, grab it. Especially if you want to bring one back to Canada.
I like to go back and forth, even on the nose, with the next whiskey, because then you really start to see the different styles.
Well, speaking of going back and forth, are we going over to the next whiskeys? Or are we waiting?
Yeah, let's do it.
And you've already, when I was away for my family thing, we did Lot 40 already, right? But not Dave Minton Lot 40.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
I did not ruin your spiel, Dave.
Anyone here that knows me, and there are some of those who know me, this is the reason I'm here. Before I did this role, I used to own and operate a few different bars and restaurants. I worked behind the bar for 20 years of my life. Lot 40, when it came out in 2012, and I was introduced to it, it became my house rye at all my spots. Fell in love with it. Now, it has a bit of a story to it. It was first released in 1998 by our previous master blender, Michael Booth. And you could imagine, back in 1998, that's when I started bartending in 97, 98. Drinks were served in glasses shaped like this. They were neon colored. They were fruity, juicy. Vodka was the spirit of choice. This is a time when if you asked for a Jameson, a bartender in North America would look at you very strangely because they didn't know what Jameson was in 1997 or 98. It was different times for whiskey. So when our then master blender chose to release 100% rye whiskey in the time of Sex and the City and Cosmopolitans, what do you think happened? Anyone? It didn't work. Bourbon hadn't exploded around the world yet. Irish whiskey hadn't, obviously. Japanese whiskey. It wasn't a big push for whiskey cocktails, certainly back then. It flopped. Somebody said it flopped. So badly that the distillery, opened since 1857 and kept every bottle they've ever made, didn't keep a bottle of this. That's how poorly it did. Now, fast forward, there's a few people on here, Elford and Sewell, who went through this with me. Even they're younger than me. Early 2000s. Every bartender in New York City and London, England started pulling out classic cocktail books. Bourbon explodes around the world. It's the coolest whiskey in the world to drink. Irish whiskey explodes. Japanese whiskey comes in. Rye whiskey, American rye whiskey starts coming back. Everybody wants to drink a Manhattan or a martini at lunch because Mad Men replaced Sex in the City. Customers started asking for classic cocktails. This was an exciting time to be a cocktail bartender in the early 2000s. Another decade goes on. Someone at Pernod Ricard, Corby, says, remember that 100% rye whiskey that failed so miserably? What if we brought it back? And Dr. Don was our master blender at the time. And he said, let's do it. But he did a little twist to it. So what you've got in your hand, your Lot 40, the old, if you're an American, you won't be used to this label yet. If you're in the UK, Canada, this is just the newer label. Same whiskey inside. 100% rye, as Gina said, 100% unmalted rye. Column distilled once to strip away any harsh qualities. 8,000 liter pot still for 12 hours. We get rid of the heads, the tails. That's the green grass soapy characteristics. We keep the hearts. That's your floral, rye bread, baking spices, citrus notes. Goes into New American Oak grade 2 char. Tames the beast. Warming vanilla, toffee, caramel. I mean, you look at it, and it's this gorgeous amber. Deep amber. It's 43 ABV, so 86 proof. Not too high. I mean, it's almost like I get a little bit of a perfume when I first nose it. A little bit of light oak, certainly rye bread, some warm honey. Somebody once said mint, and that's like stuck in my head now. A little bit of oregano, and almost like a light rose. Really complex. First sip. It's complex, it's smooth. I mean, you get the heavy rye right away. Baking spices, clove. I get a little bit of white pepper and almost some like roasted nuts to it. And certainly Dawn always says this English toffee, but I get that from it. I don't always think of big American ryes as something that you like to sip on. Love them in cocktails. But this is a rye. It's got an elegance to it. I love sipping on this. And it will hold its own against any big vermouth or herbal liqueur. So, I mean, this makes an incredible Manhattan. But one thing we love seeing across the U.S., Canada, the UK, this does very well. Bartenders are taking that elegant side, and they're not just doing classics with it. They're doing tall, zesty, refreshing cocktails. They're doing citrus forward. They're having a lot of fun with it, which we love to see, because I just can't drink classic cocktails every day of my life. Well, I could, but, you know, it's nice to have variety. What have you seen?
I've seen you do it a few days in a row, I'll say that.
Yeah, you were right next to me. Good for the steak. I like that. That's great.
Mm-hmm.
Meanest Manhattan. Gina and I agree. I know Gina certainly agrees. This is her go-to for Manhattans.
Yep. This is my Manhattan.
Silky spicy. That's good. Bready, baking spices. Yep. Ginger. Yep.
Mm-hmm. We do have a couple questions about the rye grain. They're asking about, you know, different types of rye. Are they growing different types of rye? And I think what you're meaning here is like different hybrids. And how does that affect flavor? Dawn, I know, has been working with Brasetto rye farmers. We've been planting Brasetto rye, which is, fun fact, the first hybrid rye grain that Canada ever produced. Anyways, he started working with him years ago, and now we're starting to see it in the bottles. But what he noticed and could measure it in the lab was that that particular hybrid grain of rye had a bigger, bolder spice to it. So, you know, he's manipulated how long he's aging it and all of that to really match the flavor profile that he wants, using a grain that's got a even bigger, bolder spice note to it. So yes, there are hybrids. I was just actually looking it up just to get a little bit more fun facts on it. And they also said that Canada produces 2% of the world's rye. Fun facts today.
Crazy. And I was going to say, definitely re-ask the question tomorrow, because I was in BC with Don a couple of weeks ago, and he was telling me some fun stuff that he's playing around with. So I think he'd be excited to talk about some experiments he's doing.
Mm-hmm. One question for you, Dave, from Jessica. If you could choose one bottle of rye to bring to the U.S., what would it be?
Great question. I mean, if it was one of ours already in the U.S., so I mean, I'm thinking because there's so much rye happening overseas right now, over in Europe.
Mm-hmm.
There's a really cool rye out of Germany. I think it's called Stork Rye. There's a bartender turned whiskey maker, and it's doing really well in Germany. I think I'd bring that to show off in the U.S. What
That's
the
fun.
Germans are doing. Oh, Elford's still making the Cinnabon with the Lot 40. That's a good drink. Chris Elford did a pop up in Toronto. Was it last year? Lot 40 drinks. It was great. So good. Yeah, this is just to wrap up that Lot 40 before we go to the next one. It was when this role came to me, I'd been using it so much that literally the company came and said, "Hey, you're selling so much of this. Would you like to consult with us?" And I was supposed to do this for 1 year, and now it's going in year 11. So I've just really been enjoying the role, the challenge. And I will say, JP Weiser's outsells everything in the US, Canada. It's huge. But if it wasn't for Lot 40, no bartender 10 years ago in the United States of America was letting me into their doors, through their doors, just to teach about Canadian whiskey. Even all of my dearest friends that I've done pop-ups with and exchanged guest shifts over the years, they're like, no. And then when they tried Lot 40, they were like, oh, there's something very different about this. So I think Lot 40 really was one of the brands that changed the game and people's perceptions on Canadian whiskey. There's so many great ones out now. This will always hold a significant place in my heart. Now on to the next, and I hope you left some Lot 40 so you can try them side by side. Probably doesn't show to the camera, but I hope you're seeing what I'm seeing. The Lot 40 Dark Oak. It's a little richer, darker in color. Yeah, it's Dawn. I think. What did he? You probably have it in your tasting notes. I think Dawn said it was like roasted pecans or pecans, however you say it. This one was. It was an experiment in the sense that we only made a few thousand bottles of this as a one-off, just to be sold once, and it was released in March 2020. I'm sure you all remember that was not a good month. COVID hit. Every bar in the world closed down. So our one brand that was sold to bars, released in the same month, it didn't do so well. But the World Whiskey Awards gave it the title of World's Best Rye. Not Canadian whiskey. It won World's Best Rye that year. So because of that, I'm happy to say we kept making it for the U.S., for Canada, for overseas, and now it is here to stay as long as you keep drinking it. Now, it's a bigger, bolder.
It's still getting golds.
It's still getting gold. It's not going away.
World Whiskeys.
World Whiskey Awards last week, it won Best Canadian Rye.
Yep.
It's a category winner. Now, after the spiel of Lot 40, this is a bigger, bolder expression of Lot 40, is what it is. It's, the brand team will tell you that it retains the core essence of Lot 40, which it does. It's that 100% unmalted rye, column, pot distilled, New American Oak, Char 2. Now, this is where it changes. Dr. Dawn then regauges it in New Oak Char 4. And it was a horrible month, Thomas. That brings on all these extra nuances. It's almost like let's walk through it. I mean, I almost get like an oolong tea, some white pepper, maybe black pepper on the nose. Someone the other day at a tasting in Victoria said like a toasted cumin, and now I can't get that out of my mind. Sourdough rye, naturally. Some honey, vanilla. Now, first sip. Heavy rye spices, obviously. To get that white pepper now, not so much black pepper on the palate, more white pepper. Walnuts. I get and this is from the number 4 char, I get almost a sweeter kind of vanilla ice cream cinnamon to it compared to the original Lot 40 that's a little drier, you might say. Cinnamon, charred wood. This is great. The other big difference is instead of 86 proof, that Lot 40 is, this is 96 proof. So certainly in the US, it packs a little more punch. People pay a little more attention to it. Lot 40 is great in a Manhattan. I challenge anyone, sit down and make an old fashioned with this.
Mm-hmm.
Such a good whiskey for an old fashioned.
Mm-hmm.
It's about.
Someone has.
Sorry.
Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. Lacey said that she's got an espresso martini with this on it, and I know Dave Mitten has gotten me on drinking espresso martinis with Lot 40, but I usually drink it with the other Lot 40, not dark oak, in my espresso martinis.
Well, Lacey, after this call, I have a meeting with North America's 50 Best in Vancouver Cocktail Week, so I will be out in Vancouver next month and April.
Mm-hmm.
I'll be coming by for that martini.
Someone is asking about dark oak being non-chill filtered. I know Don's going to go in deep on chill filtration tomorrow. He's very passionate about that topic.
Yeah.
But Dave, would you like to answer the question about whether it is chill filtered or not?
Yes, this is chill filtered. Right now, since I've started with the company, Dawn only had one expression that was non-chill filtered, but that's done. Everything we do is chill filtered for the moment. To be honest, I know the one that was non-chill filtered. It was a distillery exclusive. JP Weiser's Red Letter. There'll be a few people on here that would remember it. And it's the same thing as the caramel coloring. The whiskey geeks and aficionados love the non-chill filtered, but it would be the general consumer who would say there was something floating in the whiskey and they would return it. So it honestly just became less of a headache. But Dawn will get into chill filtration tomorrow and get geeky on it.
Can you go over just like one to the other, the exact differences between Lot 40 and dark oak one more time?
For you, Gina, anything. All right. Look at the legs on that. Okay. Lot 40 dark oak. Both start as 100% unmalted rye. Both are once column distilled on a very American style, strips out all the harsh qualities, characteristics, but leaves all the flavor from the grain and yeast. We then pot distill both, 8,000 liters still, 12 hours. We discard of the heads. That's the green grass characteristics. We keep the hearts, which are all your rye bread, your citrus, your floral notes, everything we love about a rye. We discard of the tails. That's kind of your soapy characteristics. So now you've got these lovely heart cut. It goes into New American Oak, char number 2, which gives you that vanilla toffee flavoring that goes so well with the rye, tames the beast, as we always say. And then Lot 40 is bottled at 86 proof. Lot 40. Dark oak, after it spends the time in the the char number 2, Dr. Dawn regauges it in char number 4, and that brings on a lot more of the what I was talking about, that vanilla ice cream, the cinnamon, the sweetness, richness to it, makes it a little bolder. And it gets bottled at 96 proof opposed to 86 proof. So extra maturation and higher proof are the two bigger things.
Someone's asking about, what chill filtration removes. It removes a few things, but when you chill the whiskey down, it basically separates. You can separate out certain residues and particles that you can remove. And those things eventually, through time in a bottle, if you don't remove them, like a non-chill filtered whiskey, can cause like a cloudiness or a haze in the whiskey over time. So again, like Dave said, a consumer looking at a bottle of whiskey on a shelf who doesn't really understand that haze is fine, they might think there's some contamination to it. So, but it is removing particles and residues, a few things, but what those things kind of do over time is you could see some particulates like floating around in the bottle, like Dave said, but also you could see like a cloudiness or haziness form through time.
Somebody just asked price of dark oak. General rule is, I mean, for instance, here in Ontario, lot 40 is, I think it's like $38, $39 a bottle. Dark oak's about $20 more anywhere you are. So add $20 to your price of lot 40 in your market.
Mm-hmm. How long in number 4 char?
100 days, right? Production purposes.
Mm-hmm. And that's all of our questions. I think we're going to wrap it up here. 4 minutes early. One thing before we hand it back to Liz, I just want to say thank you to not only all of our students, but to Lush Life, who has partnered with us on bringing this course, 4 years now. It's been an awesome partnership, and I hope that we continue years down the road to continue to bring this to you all with Lush Life, because you guys are all amazing to work with, Liz. So thank you so much.
You as well, Gina.
We couldn't do it without you. Literally, we could not do this without you. We appreciate you all so much.
This is definitely the best way that I could start my year for the 4th year in a row.
This is an awesome way to start the year.
Yeah.
Way to start the year.
Great kickoff. It really sets the tone.
And then as you will all see, when I travel a lot, and Gina she's very kind. She gives me a list of any city market I'm going to shoot you guys a message over Instagram or email and just simply say, I'm coming to town. Do you want me to come hang out at your bar? Do you want to go for a drink? But we'll get to love to meet you all in person. And then, hopefully we'll all get to work together at some point too, whether it's at a cocktail festival, whiskey fest.
Mm-hmm.
Love to keep the relationship going.
Absolutely. And students, any questions that we said we'll get to tomorrow with Dawn, I have recorded, so don't worry. But yeah, thank you all so much. All of our 100 students from this program, Gina, Dave, Ricky, of course, as always. Like I said, this is just the best way to kick off our year. And this program has continued to grow over the last 4 years. This year was our highest applicant rate, and the engagement from our students this year has been incredible. So it's exciting to see, even in our 4th year, it's just excitement grows and continues to grow. So thank you all so much. This is goodbye to everyone that's not a student, but not to students just yet, because we'll see you tomorrow for our last class with Dr. Dawn. So tune in for that at 3 on that Zoom room. But until hopefully next year, we will see you then.
All right. Bye, everybody.